You know, so many couples are having children when they're in their 40s or 50s that many people are critical, saying that you're too old to have children in your 50s. But here we are, Joan and me, in our 70s, and we can climb up the steepest riverbanks, climb mountains, take extremely long hikes, and even jump off cliffs and paraglide, which is one of our favorite things to do. And in this video, we'll continue to show you how, even in your 70s or 80s or even beyond nowadays, you can be extremely vigorous and very, very healthy with modern medicine and knowing how to take care of yourself. So our favorite sport really is paragliding. To fly in the air, you have to run as hard as you can to build up enough wind to lift up the sail, and then you're off. So here we are. You think we'd be old, but we could have had children in our 40s or 50s and be doing this now with them. There is no reason to think of 40 or 50 is too old to have children, because here we are in our 70s flying over the mountains and having an extremely romantic time with each other. Yes, in our 70s, it's so romantic to fly around in the sky, saying hello to each other, waving to each other, blowing kisses to each other, observing the infinity of God's incredible creations, and feeling as though we were in our 20s. This is the way it is nowadays. So this is a story I will tell you about one of our many paragliding trips in which we enjoyed the romance of flying around like avatars, but it ended in a tragedy. But even the way my wife handled that tragedy demonstrates the power and the strength to recover from almost any amazing injury, as well as a young person. We zoom around, waving to each other back and forth, blowing kisses through the sky, watching the incredible horizon, and flying back and forth past each other, in front of each other, and behind each other. At this point, Joan's even waving to me, going up and down as a way of saying, hello, I love you, in the air. And we're like 20-year-olds, jumping off of mountains, flying through the air, enjoying life like in the old days nobody did at our age. This was really a perfect day to fly. The wind was just the way it always should be. Our judgment to fly on a day like this was just perfect, and there was no threat or danger, just pure joy, pure fearless joy. And we're preparing now to land, but before we land, we'll do some amazing acrobatics, doing 360-degree verticals that would just normally make you think a 20-year-old would get sick and nauseated from. But for us, it was a joy. There was no inhibition. We just flew up and down, around in circles, upside down and right side up, before we finally decided it was time to land. You can see the shadow of our paragliders as we approach for a final approach, coming in eventually to land, ending another perfect journey in the air, another loving, romantic trip in the sky. Coming into a perfect landing point. Sorry almost that we're on the ground, wishing we were still in the air, defying gravity. The next day, the wind conditions were not that favorable, and it was a very difficult launch with a long run. Now, eventually, once you get off the ground, you're safe once you have a good launch. But this was not a good launch, and this was not a good day to fly. Even though we love flying, we made the mistake of going by the paragliding book and being patient, waiting for a bit of an updraft, and then being decisive, too decisive. In any event, it was a good day once we were in the air, but it should have been auspicious that we had trouble ahead. So we come in for another landing, and we think of nothing but joy, but we're in for a sad turn of events in the next few days. The wind was so bad the next day that we didn't even think about paragliding, and we just visited Yellowstone and watched Old Faithful. And it's amazing to me that we saw Old Faithful last in 1967. It really is Old Faithful. Every hour, hour and a half, it explodes from the surface. Joan spots a moose, and we had a great day and made a great decision not to fly because the wind was just too squirrely. The last day of our trip, however, we made a big mistake. The wind was so squirrely and my launch so terrible that it should have told us to quit. This is truly a terrible launch because the updraft was so poor, so unpredictable, and the wind so changeable and squirrely that the adage of paragliders is totally wrong, that you should just wait and be patient and then be aggressive and decisive. That was completely wrong. We found it out in a tragic way on this fateful day, the very, very last day of our paragliding trip. So while I was flying, after this awful launch, I had no idea that Joan had crashed. Because once you're in the air high enough, you're okay and you don't feel the problem. It should have been auspicious that a red-tailed hawk was following me all the way while I was flying down to my final landing, and I had no idea what had happened to Joan until I landed and they radioed it down to me. What I discovered is that Joan had had a terrible crash into the mountain on launch, and Joan was completely immobilized, thank goodness, and only God could have saved her, and he did. Her injuries included all cervical and thoracic vertebrae were broken. Her fourth and eighth thoracic vertebrae were completely exploded and should have caused paraplegia. All her cervical vertebrae were fractured, as well as her thoracic vertebra, and there were unstable cervical fractures, 3 of which should have caused quadriplegia. In addition, almost all her ribs were broken, requiring a chest tube and oxygen. Her right jaw was broken, and only God could have spared her from death and a terrible neurologic deficit. Her pain was immense, as one can imagine, getting gradually better after about 7 or 8 weeks. She had a miracle recovery after a devastating injury, and she recovered like a 20-year-old would, despite the fact that she was in her 70s. So once again, I repeat that people in their 40s and 50s should not be hesitant to have children, because they can still be vigorous and resistant to almost any injury, just like Joan was.